Well, hey, we want to start off today with just a question to get some interaction and review. What jumps out at you most from what you heard yesterday? What do you remember the most and is most impactful?
The DNA stuff is very good.
DNA.
The releasing of young leaders, I think that was interesting.
Yeah.
Talking about the releasing it into a pioneering setting rather than into an already established area. I thought that was good for me.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Teaching to be teachers.
Teaching to be teachers.
My mother-in-law was over for the year, and I taught her and my wife a lot of the stuff we talked about.
Okay.
Passing with that.
All right, good. The teaching of teachers.
Just the dying of letting things die, dying yourself, and just letting God be God.
Good.
Drawing out what Christ has already put in.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I think one of your early comments where you talked about the high anxiety in churches about witnessing
Yeah.
and that we have to have the right words. And when you talked about that it's not about what we say, it's how we listen. And so that in actual fact, evangelism becomes much more pastoral. It becomes actually pastoral skills of listening to people with their passion, pain and purpose. There we go.
You got it. All right. You ready to be one of our trainers? Yeah, we're teaching teachers. So, good. Yeah, if you come to the First Story Greenhouse, there's a lot on that subject, actually, on how our methods don't save anybody. Jesus does, and we just have to be messengers. Good.
I think the whole principle of this, the reminder again about making everybody a first disciple of Jesus, just to get away from that codependency. And we often complain that the Catholic system is, the priest is the mediator, but I think it's as bad.
We're just as bad, yeah. We've had a reformation of doctrine, but not of church. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the thought that a disciple is someone who listens to Jesus and does what he says.
Yeah.
Full stop. Marvellous.
That's it, right there.
That's great.
Yeah, and really these principles, I don't know if I said this yesterday, but I said to somebody else, but somebody asked me a couple years ago, well, what are you going to do next? What are you going to be teaching next? And what are you going to live out next? Because we're so used to the next program, or the next way, or the
Fad.
whatever it is, next fad. And I just said, I don't see this as a fad in any way. These are principles that you can plug a whole different bunch of methodologies out of. But this is the way I've done church and lived my life for 20 years, and it's the way I'll do it until I go home to be with Jesus. I'm not waiting for the next new thing. So it really is that simple, the way you said it, Max. It's that simple, and yet it's that profound, and it can be that endearing forever. It's always been.
There's a fear that we have that this would be a fad, that it would be a short-lived thing and then the next thing would come along. And that's always a danger. So I've given some thought to the difference between a real movement and a fad. And the way I see it is the difference is that a real movement leaves behind transformation, whereas a fad doesn't. I mean, wearing hush puppy shoes is a fad. Hula hoops once was a fad. Doesn't change anything. But if we leave behind changed lives, it's not a fad. And so I liken it to this. If you have a pool in your backyard and it's been years since it's been cleaned, so it's full of just scum and ugliness. If you throw a rock in the middle of the pool, it will send waves. Energy will be dispersed among the pool, and then it will eventually evaporate and it will just go right back to the way it was.
Yeah.
But if you throw a tablet of chlorine the same size as that rock, it will have the waves, it will disperse, it will go back to its glassy surface, but there will be a chain reaction in the water that will transform and clean that pool. So if we're not leaving behind a transformed and clean environment, we should disappear. We should just be a fad. So you talk about evangelism being more natural, relational, just pastoring, you say. And in a sense, that's kind of what we're seeing some of our people do, where, like John Wesley says, the world is my parish. One of the prophet on our team has decided he's going to transform a whole city by just seeing this is my church. And so he pastors everybody in the city, and it's brought incredible transformation to a town, from chasing away corruption, cleaning the streets, bringing in business, the schools being revitalized. Everything about the place has changed because they have seen it as their responsibility to shepherd this place, even though they're not all Christians, obviously. Good. What else? Anything else jump out at you?
Can I ask a question? You may deal with it later on. I was really disturbed with something you said yesterday in a good way, but the whole thing, our whole system is led by people from an academic perspective. Our colleges, it's all about passing, getting degrees, passing assignments and all that sort of thing. So we actually introduce little lecturers into our pulpits, and that's actually created a 200-year church movement. And I'm sort of thinking, gee, that's rare. Whether it's sick or dangerous or whatever else like that. Are you going to address that issue?
I am. That's the last thing we'll talk about. We'll talk about the Ephesians 4:11 gifts and the implication of that. And yeah, it's a huge thing. The book I think my book coming out in March will be my biggest paradigm shifting book I've written. Honestly, I think it is the Primal Fire. Yeah. Alan Hirsch said the fivefold gifts are almost a silver bullet.
Yeah.
And I believe it is a silver bullet. Because it's Jesus. And if there is a silver bullet, it's got to be Jesus. And the primal fire is about Jesus. So I said actually in the book, Alan says in Permanent Revolution, this is almost a silver bullet. But I go further and say this is the silver bullet because it's us becoming who Jesus intended us to be by the power of Christ. And so Alan endorsed my book saying, I used to say this, but now I say, that's his endorsement of my book. So it's really more of an endorsement of his book. But that's Alan, though. So yeah, I think it's that important. I really do. So it'll be at the end. And we'll have, today, we have almost half as much content as yesterday. So I will not be in as big a pressure to push us along. We'll have more time for interaction. But today will be far more practical than yesterday. Anything else from yesterday? Or questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder about an existing large church that, these principles and this idea of this organic community,
Sure.
are they transferable to an existing large church that has all its structures?
Yeah. In the book Church Transfusion, we tell the story of 5 churches, and Ed's is one of them. The reason we chose 5 is they're all very different. They come from different backgrounds. One's a vineyard church, one's a Baptist church plant, a 100-year-old Baptist church. One's a church plant, Ed's was, and so was the vineyard one. One was a Reformed church that was a mega church of 4,000 that did this. Now that's in Irvine, California, Orange County. It started, Dave Gibbons is the pastor, it's called New Song, and it's a large Asian American church of 4,000, I think. And what you never hear is that almost to a T, every megachurch pastor has a burnout. And you don't really hear about it, where they melt down and they have to go on a sabbatical. They're forced oftentimes. So Dave had to go on a sabbatical for a year. He went to Bangkok, and this is the way these guys are. He decided, well, while I'm on sabbatical in Bangkok, why don't I start a church? They're hard-driven guys. Yeah. It is an addiction. It's an addiction to adrenaline, I think, is what it is. Well, in fact, the last session was about leadership, which you always have to be careful you get the F in there. But my first time I did the PowerPoint, on one slide I forgot the F, and everybody said, oh, that's revealing. Yeah. So anyway, we talk about how the kind of leadership that produces this church that you're used to is not the kind of leadership that's going to catalyze movements, or we would have done it by now. Well, that's especially true. The kind of person who can create a mega church has a lot of things working for them that work against movement. So it's very difficult to find someone with that kind of drawing gift releasing. And that's why so many megachurch pastors stay with their megachurch until they die, and then the church struggles with who do we fill that pulpit with. But Dave Gibbons is a hard-driven guy who's incredibly intelligent. He went to Bangkok to start a church during his sabbatical, and found out that you can't start a church in Bangkok the same way you do in South Orange County. It doesn't work. So the people said, you're going to have to do it more organically. And so I had already known him by that point, and the Organic Church had been out, he'd read it and other things, and he decided we're going to be more organic. So when he was done with his sabbatical, he went back to New Song and says, we are going to become an organic church. And he said, here's a few of the changes we're going to have to make. He said, first of all, if you are on staff here and you do something specialized that only you can do, we are going to fire you. We're going to let you go. We'll help try and find a place for you to go, but you're not going to remain on staff, because the staff's job now is to equip the ordinary people to do the ministry. And if we depend on you, then we're going to have to let you go. With that alone, they lost 40% of their people. And then they hit this valley and they made some turnarounds, and now there are New Song churches all over the world in most major cities, like in Bangkok, they've got one in New York, they've got in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, in London, in Paris. I mean, they're multiplying rapidly. Los Angeles. So it's now their model that they've multiplied is a more centralized model. We'll talk about that today. It is not this chain type model that multiplies even faster. We'll cover that difference, but it is definitely healthy, multiplying. And here's the biggest surprise is Dave came to realize that being Asian Americans, it's a church full of third culture people who are from one culture and another culture, and it ends up becoming, they're adaptable. They create their third culture, which is made up of both. And these people are highly adaptable missionaries. And so they've catalyzed that to send out people to be missionaries in all the domains of society. So they're actually seeing transformation in technology and in business and in Hollywood and movies and television and things like that. And these people who are not pastors are missionaries. So it's been a fantastic thing. They've grown back some. They're really done well. So it is a large, very established church built on basically Hybels / Rick Warren model, and then made a huge transition.
The other thing that I saw was helping a church in Atlanta, it's a couple thousand members, but they, of course, that church is never going to be organic. They'll leave the senior pastor doesn't see it that way, but the missions pastor does. And so what he's done is he's changed is in the process of helping their missionaries either transition out from their support or to be finding new ways to support so they can start more organic works in the countries that they're at. So the whole church itself isn't going to shift, but the way they're doing missions is shifting and seeing that happen. So it's going to be multiplicative all over the place.
Good. Any other questions or comments? All right. Let's talk about math a little bit, fractals actually. I am not an expert on fractals, and there's all different forms and expressions of fractals that are way over my head. But I do know that there are patterns in nature that are called fractal patterns. And one of the best ways to see it is in a fern leaf, where you see the basic shape of the leaf is also reflected in what makes up that leaf. And it goes smaller and smaller and smaller. It's a constant repetition of that same pattern. You see that in the picture? Okay. That is part of God's design in creation, and it's called fractals, where no matter how small or no matter how large it gets, it maintains this constant shape. Now, I think for us in a movement, whether you get as small as the smallest unit of church life, what do you think is the smallest unit of church life? We talked about this yesterday. What? Two. Yeah. You can't be church alone. You have to at least have two. Do you hear any verses in the Bible that talk about the numbers 2 or 3? There's a few, aren't there? Yeah. You ever hear any things that talk about the numbers 15? 100? 1,000? Probably not. There's not as many. The most prescribed size grouping in the Old and New Testament for ministry is 2 or 3. That's where the DNA needs to be. So if you get the church as small as possible, 2 or 3, that's where you want the DNA. And if you have it there, then as you go from the microscope to the telescope, from the micro to the macro movement, the DNA will be consistent. So no matter how large your movement gets, DNA will still be replicating, and that'll be the identifying mark of this movement. So for us, if you just look at a right triangle, there's the shape of a right triangle, and that represents for me the D, the N, and the A. What's the D stand for? Divine truth. What's the N? Nurturing relationships. What's the A? Apostolic mission. Now if you take that right triangle and you double it, it's still a right triangle. When you double it again, it's a right triangle. And no matter how many times you multiply that shape, and it gets larger and larger, it's still a right triangle. The DNA stays consistent. So for us, as we multiply to infinity and beyond, if the DNA is in the smallest unit of church life, then no matter how large and expansive our movement gets, there will be a consistency 10, 15, 100 generations removed that will remain pure. When you bite into an apple, you realize you're experiencing the same experience someone had 8,000 years ago when they bit into an apple. The apple hasn't changed, even though it's not the same apple. Because the DNA in the seeds, every generation, produces the same product. That's what we want in the DNA. That's why we emphasize DNA all the time. In fact, I'm accused in all my books of repeating myself. Guilty as charged. Because I'm assuming you're reading this book and you haven't read any of my other books. And I got to cover the DNA. So it's going to be in every single book I write. Because it's that important. Every time we teach on the DNA. Because that, my friends, is the only way we're assured that multiple generations removed, it's still going to be pure. So let's talk about networks and structures for a moment in a movement. And size groupings. I did some serious study in the field of sociology and in the field of network theory. And I'll bring some of that to light in the next hour or less. When it comes to size groupings in sociology, there's a lot of information of what is the best thing to do in a certain size group. In other words, if you were going to accomplish something, how many people would you want to have to accomplish that? And what I have found is there are ideal size groupings of people for certain tasks. But if you try to get that same size grouping to accomplish something that's not ideal, it messes things up. Make sense? So here are the size groupings that I see. First is, I mentioned this, 2 or 3. If you want to change someone's life, this is where you have to get. A disciple in relationship with another disciple, or 2. Where there's that kind of life-on-life ministry. We typically think this sermon to 150 people is going to change their lives. You know how rare that actually happens? And when it does happen, it requires a supernatural, divine miracle of God where He shows up in this flood of revival. Oh, my phone's gone off. Don't you love the sound? Yeah, I always love the second day when we... Wow, it's like music to my ears. All right. Ed, why don't you pray for us?
Creator of the universe, creator of our souls, creator of our salvation, we thank you so much for your presence in our lives, and your presence in our community here. God, I pray that you will help us to have your eyes. We would actually look and see people as downcast and like sheep without a shepherd. And that we will beg you, and we are begging you now, to raise up men and women, both saved and not yet saved, to be caring and beseeching you and looking for you to change the hearts of those that are not yet coming to you. So raise up new workers, God. Raise up people that have been dormant and that should be workers. And touch this area with your gospel and all the areas that are represented in this room. And we pray that we will see new life birthed and new movements begun and a new excitement as we see boys and girls and women and men come to know Christ in fresh ways and then be released to see more movements begun all around the world. May you be glorified in this. And may we be consistent and disciplined to pray these kind of prayers until you take us home or until you return. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So I believe 2 or 3 is a size grouping for life change, where you have life on life, where you can know a person intimately and speak into their life, have a level of accountability that is truly, permanently life-changing. And so I was saying that we typically try to change an entire church at once with a sermon. And like I said, the only times that ever happens is when God, I think he gets so exhausted with waiting for us to change lives that he overpasses these principles and just says, okay, I'm going to do it this way, and blesses with this huge revival or something. But it doesn't always leave behind a lasting change because it's not filtered down to the level of life on life.
Is that the point though? Like in a big church where there's 500 people, they're already Christian.
They should be, yes.
They're already in the room, for example.
Yeah. They're already in the room and we're praying for revival. I'm not against that, but if we never get down to the life on life, Christianity is lived. It thrives life on life. If you skip that, if it becomes a program for a group that's larger, you're probably never going to see lasting change. Is that what you meant, Anthony?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Like you said yesterday, they really preached the gospel to Christians because they had the gospel. We're not trying to transform a Christian's life in terms of introducing them to Jesus.
You'd be surprised how many people are Christians, but they need the gospel.
Yeah.
And the fact is, I need the gospel more now than the first day I got saved. Yeah.
I think I'm talking about what you said yesterday, how the teaching is more dialogue and
Yes. Yeah. We're trying to change people with a sermon, and I just don't think that's the way it's meant to be.
And if you're listening to people, and especially at this level, one-on-one, one-on-two. So at the cigar shop where I'm at, there's a guy named Steve who's a great golfer. And he told me some golf course down there that I should be golfing at, but there's no time to do it. One with those kangaroos on every. He's a savant when it comes to golf. He remembers every hole he's ever played, every undulation of every green. And before I left, he said, when you come back, I had this interaction with Jesus in a hospital room. So he goes, yeah, I want to tell you about it. So I'm looking forward to coming back and hearing about it, but it's he and I conversing, and he's going to tell me about Jesus visiting his hospital room, and then we are going to have a conversation about how life can be transformed and how we can pass that on. But it only happens when you put yourself in the context of listening and to the Spirit, listening to their story. But you got to insert yourself into those kind of conversations.
So if you're in some congregation and you are hearing a moving telling of something from the sermon, you literally have to be willing to, in front of everybody, divulge a very vulnerable part of yourself to have this affect you in any way. Granted, you could sit there in the quietness of your own heart and be changed, but honestly, we all know you're most changed when it comes out your mouth and into your actions. And so that's not the best. And where it does work is where people just say, forget my reputation, I'm going to stand up and confess in front of all these people, which is not the norm. And so it's very rare to see people changed in larger size groupings.
No, I was just going to say, I think what you're saying is really valid, and I think it's really important to make a shift from what is the predominant way
Yeah.
that we expect people to learn, or we expect that people will be challenged. But I think we can do that without diminishing the fact that for some people, and it could be the minority who perhaps learn well by listening, and I suppose when I think of the moments that are most riveting to me in terms of God, they usually come from a sermon or perhaps some sort of testimony, but without me actually engaging one-to-one with that person. So I suppose let's not diminish the fact that it can happen, but we should never expect that that should be the best way or the most predominant way.
All right, and I agree because it's true for me too. However, are you married? Would you say a sermon has had more effect on your life than your relationship with your husband?
At times.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, I know.
Absolutely true. And our relationships, but I don't think we need to say, well, we have to throw that entirely down.
Yeah.
No, we're not saying go entirely.
Wait till I get to the end of the slide. Wait till I get to the end of the slide. There's a place for it. I'm not saying it's not. Yeah.
Lastly, just shortly, last night I spent about 2 hours with two young guys in their 20s, and we ended it with about a 45-minute detailed conversation. I guarantee you, for me, it's one of the highlights of my trip here for 3 weeks, spending that time with those 2 or 3, hearing their struggles, sharing some of my struggles. We may never meet again, or that intimate, but that. And then we could, and I even told myself, well, if you guys move to Phoenix, I didn't offer to move here, so if you guys move to Phoenix, would it be great?
I'd rather live here than Phoenix, to be honest with you. I've been to Phoenix.
Would it be great if we could do this every week? Well, what change would that bring? This really is true. You'll see as it progresses up how big this beats so much.
Can I just, that's amazing. I've got people in my congregation who do not value close, intimate relationships. In fact, they would think, I don't want to have that relationship with anybody, maybe my husband or maybe my kids. So, for example, it light your fire and it would light mine because that's what I live for, that sort of connection with people. But I've got people who just don't want to connect with others that way. Now, I think it may be an absence of in the DNA process or even a connection with Jesus, because it seems to me that you fall in love with Jesus, you fall in love with people around about you. But I've got people who basically would not hold that up as a value.
Yeah, I would see that as a symptom of a problem, actually, not as just let's surrender to that.
Right. That needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. It's virtually impossible to fulfill the one another's without one another.
Or actually possible.
Can I just pitch in a comment?
Yeah.
I might be stealing your thunder with where you go here, but the first time I heard you speak about this and I read that in your books, I read the Bible just to see if you guys are telling the truth. And I noticed that Jesus' ministry, yes, he spoke to thousands, but when he did, he said, if anyone gets it, good on you, see you later. So he didn't put much energy in it. Who you got yesterday, let him hear. And then he invested really his energy into
The few.
speed changing, and then 12, and then whatever, 9, well, I don't know, 7%, 80% energy.
Yeah.
So I thought, yeah, he did it. That's his model.
It's good enough for Jesus, good enough for me.
Almost a big crowd something, he would pitch out concepts, and then it was narrowed down.
Or he'd even say things that were intentionally meant to be confusing. And at times he said things that were outright offensive to the crowds. Or Peter would say, hey, there's a large crowd waiting for you. He says, it's time to go. Now, 2 or 3 is actually, if you are going to reproduce, you've got to start with 2 or 3. In fact, if any of you have kids, I imagine it involved 2 people, not more. And even God himself exists in community of 3. So it's a pattern that even God lives within. The next size grouping is what I think of as family. All right, it's 12 to 15. It's a group that's large enough to have diversity around the group and yet intimacy at the same time. where everyone can know everyone well. And yet you can have very different people in the group. And that's the way family is really meant to be, especially a spiritual family, when you're talking about spiritual family. But these numbers, I get them not just from church or the Bible. These are actually numbers you can read about in crime, in terrorist activities, in social change of any type. Because this is the way God created us to be. But 12 to 15 is the best size grouping for intimacy and diversity at the same time. It is the worst size grouping for leadership decisions. Yeah. Because you see, you will not find easily consensus with 12 people. And that's why Satan has convinced us to form committees to make decisions. Because nothing changes. Because not everyone will agree to it. So what it is it's great for family, for relationships, for existing and sharing with life with one another. It's terrible to have all 12 come up with a decision all the time. The next size grouping is 25 to 75, and this is the best size grouping for training people, for equipping them to do the work, similar to what we're experiencing right here and now, where you can get to know each other, you can have a level of intimacy, but it's for the purpose of a task, for a mission. So I can find out, I can evaluate how each of you are. I can give you an assignment. You go out and try it. You come back. We debrief. We give you a little bit more. Go out and try it this way. That's the best size grouping for that kind of interaction where we are actually training and equipping people to do a good job. All right?
You missed that one.
Which one?
Oh, no, you said 70 to 75.
I know. Let me just apologize. I actually, when David asked for this, I was a little hesitant to send it. I did not create this. This is created by someone else in our ministry, and my standards are not met on this. So there's the 300 to 500 category, which we're going to get to, is not on there. So thanks for pointing that out, Graham.
And the 70 should be 25.
Yeah, it's misprinted too. It should be 20 to 25.
Pay no attention, it was printed, look what's up here.
Yeah, this is me. This is somebody interpreting it. All right? Yeah. And this is more up to date. In fact, all of our trainings, wherever you go, if it's Greenhouse 1, Greenhouse 2, Church Transfusion, Primal Fire, whatever it is, the PowerPoint is always up to date because I think in PowerPoint slides. And then later I print a bulletin, but then I get more thoughts, and I change the slides immediately. I don't change the workbook for years. So it's always going to be that. It's going to be the most up to date. I'll let you know the way I think. I'm visual, and I was raised by an artist who was an animator, so I think in terms of layers of animation. So that's why the slides are the way they are. And then I create them all. So the next size grouping is 120 to 150. This would be your tribe, okay? In fact, sociologists refer to 150 as the Dunbar number. Does anybody know who Robin Dunbar is? He's a British academic. What's that? You do know.
No, I was thinking of something. I was thinking dances of wolves. But
Yeah, so was I.
Yeah. Dunbar. Yeah. No, it's an actual person. He did a study to determine how many close friends you have the capacity to have. All right? And so this was his intent. So he studied the human brain. He studied primates and their relation to one another, because he's an evolutionist. He studied patterns in history of people socializing and what size groupings. He studied crime bosses and tribes and all kinds of things in history, and he determined that you only have the capacity to have a deep friendship with up to 150 people. And 150 is an extreme. Few people can really have that many friends. It's usually a smaller number, but some have the capacity for 150. You know, it's true. I actually have 5,000 friends on Facebook. Actually, he doesn't. Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg has determined that Dunbar was wrong. The limit for friends is 5,000. Facebook will not allow you to have 5,001 friends. You have to then start having fans. And I am opposed just to the word fan. So I have probably thousands of unanswered friend requests. So Zuckerberg has a different view on friends than Robin Dunbar. However, they commissioned Robin Dunbar to study Facebook. Now here's how he defines a friend, a close friend. He says, here's how you can tell if it's somebody in your 150. If you walk into a pub and you see someone from your tribe, you will invite yourself to sit at their table. You don't have to wait for an invitation. You will just shove them over and sit, and it's acceptable. That's the kind of friend we're talking about. You can only have up to 150. So he did a study of Facebook and determined that, yes, you can have 5,000 friends on Facebook, but there's only 150 of them that are that close. So this would be your tribe. And it's amazing to see it's social groupings, even people that don't know Christ, or just that it always comes back down to the size grouping. The next size grouping is 300 to 500. Now, this is something you can find Yes, question?
So, what do you mean by 12 to 15 churches in the bracket?
I'll tell you about that in a moment. Yeah. 300 to 500 is, you can find data sociologically on this size grouping, but it's very thin. There's not a lot there. But I find that this is a great size grouping if you're going to pass on information to a group of people that can then take it, own it, and pass it on. Not life change, but informational change. All right? So shifting paradigms kind of an idea, but not necessarily life on life type change, but just getting word out to as many people as possible in a memorable fashion.
School shepherd.
Yeah. All right? And then beyond that is the unlimited multitudes. Now let me show you how we take into account in an organic church movement all these size groupings. Now this is us, and we are a church planting movement type of a thing. We are not an established church changing. We include those, but we started as, let's start something fresh and new, all right? So if you are in an established church trying to make changes, some of this will be helpful and some of it will just be interesting, but won't relate to you. But this relates to everyone. For us, the Life Transformation Group, which I'll tell you about in the next session this afternoon, is the instrument we use for life change. Life transformation groups. It's a group of 2 or 3. They meet once a week for about an hour, men with men, women with women. Women's groups go longer than an hour. We do 3 things. We take in scripture throughout the week. We're accountable to reading the same books. We pray for one another, pray for people who don't know Christ, and we also confess our sins one to another. This is where our life change takes place. So this is the engine behind the movement, because the transformation of lives is the energy that pushes movements forward. It's the only energy that will work, that will create movement instead of a fad, is if it's actually changing lives. So for us, this is the most important thing. Beyond that is groups of 12 to 15. This is our simple church or organic church family that meets in a home or living room, may meet in a place of business, could meet on a dormitory in a college campus, university campus. It meets in barracks and military bases. It's a spiritual family. Then 25 to 75 is our greenhouse training, or in this case, church transfusion. It's this type of an event. Now normally for greenhouse, we would, like this weekend, I will be in Melbourne doing a greenhouse training, story 1. So I'll give you the training for the first story, and that will teach you how to start a church by making disciples from lost people. Then we encourage you to meet in the region regularly, once a month, for a supportive group, to learn from each other, to share how you're doing, to pray for each other. A year later, we come back and do what we call Greenhouse Story 2, which is about multiplying leaders, networks, and movements. we realize that most of us are already educated beyond obedience. So we don't want to give it all to you at once. We want you to get the second story after you've done the first story. And then after that, there's another year of monthly gatherings. From that, we find people like Peter, like Tim, who are doing it, have been through the training and they're doing it, and we'll ask them to come in and start learning how to train. So we're teaching to teach, actually. So this is our training mechanism. So we take into consideration this size grouping, and that's for us a training thing. Then the 120 and 150 is usually a network of churches. Now we have found that a centralized network of churches will only grow to about 12 to 15 churches. After that, the death rate and the birth rate equal out, and it stays about 12 to 15 churches. And part of that is the span of care. So the solution is to reproduce other networks, rather than trying to grow one network continuously. So for us, most CMA is really a network of networks all over the world. So Ed has a network called Valley Life. Mine is called Awakening Chapels. They're very different. Mine is very decentralized, and his is a little more centralized. And there are some more centralized than Ed and Valley Life. So I'll talk about the centralized, decentralized aspect in a few minutes. So don't worry about that yet.
Just in terms of the simple church network, 12 to 15 churches, what if we're grouping churches in smaller numbers, like 6 to 8 churches?
Works fine.
To try and do mission and so on, is that going to be less effective than 12 to 15? Do you think, is there an optimum number?
I think there's an average number of 8. That's what I would say, 8 to 9.
Yeah, we have 5 to 20s.
I think
Experience.
when you're at 20, you're likely stretched beyond. That's like stretching too much butter over bread. It doesn't work, and you will eventually shrink back down. Now, that's not true for transitioning an established church into organic churches. If you were a large church with lots of people and you transitioned, you may have networks of 25 or 30, but that's not starting from scratch. And that may eventually break up into a couple of networks, because the span of care is still the issue. Okay? Now, the more decentralized you are, the less you can even tell how many are in your network.
The networks held together just because of an existing social fabric where people know each other, so you've got 15 churches, or are they held together because there's 1 or 2 or 3 individuals in that network who, let's say, act as not deliberately necessarily, but a seen as a pastor type figure who do most of the networks? That do you think?
The answer is
What's
yes.
the solution?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
Um,
One more than the other?
depending on how centralized or decentralized your network is.
And if you don't have a pastor type figure that's moving amongst that network, does it disperse typically? Or does it hold?
Can I ask you to hold that question until I get to the centralized, decentralized, and see if your question gets even more pointed after that? I still want you to ask it, but I think after I get through this, your question might be even better. Yeah. So don't forget it. Write it down if you have to, Tim. But yes, I think dispersed is a way to say it, but it could be decentralized, is what you're talking about, which is a whole other thing.
Just on that point, you here or later, I don't mind, but what actually defines network? Is it do they meet together? Do they do things together? What actually?
Yeah, I don't have a whiteboard, but it's usually a family tree. So you can trace it down to the beginning of a church by usually some apostolic. It doesn't need to be an apostle, but it could be someone who has this tendency to want to start something new. And from those roots come other connections, and it's a family tree. So that's how we would define it.
And that makes sense.
Yeah. Then I mentioned 300 to 500. So for us, that's a special gathering. It's like a conference. It's an annual affair. It's not an every week thing. It takes a lot of energy to run. It takes a lot of money to run. And so for us, it's a once a year thing, and not even every year do we do it. So, but we usually get 300 to 500 people at that, and we will share some information that is the most cutting edge thing, and then they'll take that home and put it into practice. And then for the unlimited multitudes, we write books, we have websites, we publish things, publish articles, magazines, that kind of thing. That's to reach the unlimited multitudes. There's one other size grouping that you don't see on here, and that's where leadership takes place. The reason it's not here is all of these groups, I find, are built on the previous one. So the best way to have a healthy group of 12 to 15 is to first have a healthy group of 2 to 3. And it grows from there. But the leadership group needs to have influence throughout. So I put it off to the side. It says 4 to 7, but let me tell you the actual number. It's 5. All right, it's 5. 5 is the ideal size grouping for a leadership team. It has plurality, it has diversity, and yet they can come to consensus, and if there's a tie, there's a tiebreaker. Whereas 4, that may not be the case. 6, that could not be the case. So 5 is the best number. Now here's an interesting thing that Tim sort of alluded to. Jesus lived within these concentric circles. He sent out the disciples in pairs of 2. It was Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas. This is the best size grouping to send people out as disciples, and it's where life change takes place. There's all kinds of scripture about 2 or 3. And then 4 to 7, you would have, that's the leadership core. You have Jesus, Peter, James, John, and sometimes the list would include Andrew, and sometimes it doesn't. There's a smaller grouping of more the investing in the leaders. And yeah, I think Jesus was the tiebreaker on that one. They brought Andrew in if everybody was split. Then you have 12 to 15. Those people were all part of a band of 12 apostles, right? And then those 12 were part of a group of the 70 that he trained, he sent out, he brought back, he debriefed, and he sent out again. The 70. The 70, when he left the planet, on Acts chapter 1, it says he left behind a group of 120 disciples. Apparently, Jesus missed the How to Break the 200 Growth Barrier seminar.
That's great.
When he rose from the dead, he appeared at one time to 500 people to cast this vision and say, I am alive, tell the world. Just did it once, but he did it to 500. And then he healed, he fed, and he preached to the multitudes. But he never really invested his life there. The place where we need to really see the difference is at the group of 2 or 3. Because if you get the DNA there, you'll find the DNA throughout. Unfortunately, this is the size grouping that most churches never think about. And it's really the key to the whole thing. Any questions on that?
I just have one. I'm thinking about our kids.
Yes?
For this 2 to 3. And sometimes I think we underestimate our kids' capacity for spiritual.
We do,
growth.
yeah.
How would you work this around kids? The 2 to 3.
Yeah.
Would you have an older person than a child? Would you have 2 children that are around the same age? How would you do that?
Well, we haven't really talked about life transformation groups, but we actually have an adaptation of them for children. At the books I've written on this, there's 2 actually. It's the simplest idea, so I had to write 2 books about it. Sorry. Let me explain that just because of my own ego. I wrote one book for pastors, missionaries, and leaders, and then I realized this concept's for everyone. So I wrote the second book, Search and Rescue, for all Christians. So it's more inspirational stories, and it's written in a simpler language and It's really not meant for engineers of church. It's meant for pew sitters to become disciple makers. So that's why I wrote 2 books. Also, the second one has more updated information, but everyone likes the first one the best. All right, I got that out of the system. But we have an adaptation of LTGs for children. We use questions of accountability in these things for the life change. It's our opportunity to confess sins. And so there's a list of questions in the appendix of both these books that are suited for children. A lot of the questions, I wouldn't want anyone asking my kids when they were little. But this is like, have you been nice to other people around you? Have you said something that wasn't true? Have you taken something that doesn't belong to you? The kinds of questions a kid would need to be asked. Now you can do that as peer-to-peer, and I've seen that happen with kids, siblings even. You can do it with a parent or a youth worker, a young adult, or even a children's worker. So you can adapt it any way you want to, but even still, children learn best when it's life on life. Does God care for kids? Yeah, it's obvious, isn't it? So when God wanted to give the care of children to an institution, he did not choose a school, he chose family. Family environment is the best place for kids to prosper, not Sunday school. And family involves people of different ages. It's siblings upon siblings and parents. It's grandparents. It's uncles and nieces and nephews. And all of that is what really is best context for children to grow in. And yet we send them off, and the 6th graders go in this room, and the 7th graders go in that room, and the parents are in another room altogether, and we think that's the best way to develop them. Don't think so.
A few years ago, we had a couple of some children in our house church, and we were talking about some pretty adult things. Somebody wrestling with homosexuality, somebody had a marriage that was crumbling. And the parents came to me and said, we're going to take off because I don't want my kids to hear this kind of conversation. And I said, do you really think your 10-year-old and your 12-year-old don't hear about marriages breaking up at school? Do you really think they haven't been introduced to the idea of homosexuality already at their age? Well, of course they have. So isn't this a healthy way for them to experience the trauma, the healing, the truth, and see the change that happens or the destruction that happens because of choices that people make, where they can talk about it on the drive home tomorrow with you and be brief with it all? And they really came to an idea, wow, that doesn't make sense. And we've had kids now, after doing this for in cell groups originally and now more house church, organic church setting, we have 2nd generation of people that were born into our community that are now leading some of our churches and experience the wealth of that. And it's just a tremendous, I look forward to the next 20 years and see what happens with 2 more generations before we take off for planet heaven, wherever that might be. It'll be fun to see what happens with that. So yeah, let kids be part of the experience and let them see that church is more than learning stories. It's about seeing how life is lived out and how we respond and submit to the scriptures and to the lordship of Jesus.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I had an interesting background growing up, very traditional Presbyterian church, but after church every Sunday we had lunch at my grandma's house with a couple of the other families from church. And that to me was where my discipleship took place as a child. And I would come in and out of conversations, and sometimes they'd be interesting and I'd sit there. Right. And my grandma had all these magazines, and so the kids would sit there with the magazines and pretend to read while they were and to me that was discipleship. That's what I learned about God. That's, the stuff that happened on Sunday morning was church, but this was God, and this was, this was my mum and my grandfather talking about how you manage money on a farm when you've got a huge debt. This is my, other friends who were 10 years younger than my parents and had little kids that I looked after, and you know what I mean? It was that very much. And so yeah, our church, that's how we do it. We have the conversations, the kids come in and out, and they will protect themselves, I think. Obviously, you need to be mindful that there are children around, but children will go, you know what, I'm not interested in that, I'll go away. You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, so I think we can have a little more faith in them.
I think one of the things we do that is detrimental, but we do it out of good reasons, is we try to baby-proof the world for our children. And, you know, cover all the outlets and stuff. That's great when you have toddlers, you should do that. But if they aren't toddlers, stop baby-proofing. They're no longer babies. So the way we do that in life is we try to eliminate all the dangerous choices of life. So whatever choice they make is going to be fine, healthy, safe. That's kind of the way we parent. I understand that, but here's the thing. If you eliminate all bad choices, you can choose any college you want as long as it's a Christian college that's conservative, that's part of our denomination, that's in this country, and you can drive to, and cost this much. So, I mean, we do these kind of decisions, and what it ends up doing is we take away all the dangerous choices. So we can produce moral people this way, but not loving people. Love requires that they make a choice, that they see two things and they choose one. If you don't have a choice, you don't have love. And so we have to, as our children get older, allow them exposure to both choices. So we intentionally brought our kids with us into church planting in the inner city. In fact, in the third church I started was in the barrio of East LA, in an apartment complex that the police themselves tried to avoid. And everyone in that apartment complex was a gang member, a drug addict, drug dealer, or a prostitute. And this is in East LA, so it's all Latino. And my kids, the two that I brought with me, are tow-headed blondes at this point. But here's the thing. For them, the gospel is not a theory. It's not a flannel graph presentation. The gospel has a name. Scott, Josh, Juan. These are people they know have heard the gospel and changed. So the difference between my kids and what I see with other kids, they believe the gospel. It's not just a theory that they subscribe to, it's flesh and blood. And they have seen others that have changed and fallen away. So they know the reality of it. So I am glad I didn't baby-proof their life. And today they are not only walking with Jesus, but starting churches. And my son goes out midnight to downtown LA to try and lead people to Jesus off the streets. And that's not anything anybody told him to do. In fact, I would, if I had a choice, tell him, don't do that. He got in a fight the other day, trying to protect some woman who's getting beat up. He actually wrestled the guy down and pulled him away, and then she started beating up on him. He learned a lesson. I didn't baby-proof the scenario. I didn't sanctify it or sterilize it. I just, he's learning from this. It's because I didn't protect him. So I think we need to, like you said, we need to see them as potential agents of God's kingdom and let them loose a little bit more. It's amazing if you look at the stories of the movement of church history, Christianity, how often children are used by God in dramatic ways when they're allowed to. Now, as you look at this diagram and you think of your existing church, okay, whatever church that is, Central Baptist, is that the name, or the Wave, you can see where there are some of these numbers that relate, and you can see the crossover. And there are maybe other numbers here that you don't have even in your theories right now, your ideas. My suggestion is make sure you get groups of 2 or 3 happening. I would not suggest that you carve your church up into groups of 2 or 3. It needs to be natural, organic relationships rather than forced upon them. Make it a choice, just like I just said, love needs to be a choice. So give them options, say here's a great thing, a great tool if you're interested, but if someone's not interested, don't make them do it.
Yeah. How do you transition from 2 or 3 to the 12 to 15 without it being contrived by other scripture?
Good question. How do you transition from a group of 2 or 3 to a group of 12 to 15 without making it contrived so that it's Holy Spirit driven. We used to have this great slide that was a flow chart showing you. It started with actually before groups of 2 or 3, evangelism and finding a person of peace, and then starting an LTG, and then it multiplies, and then you gather them together into a group, and then it multiplies into a network, and then a movement. It was a wonderful graphic. The problem is God kept breaking the rules. He did it other ways. And so we had to eliminate that slide because God is not linear and He's not having to submit to our good slide. We have discovered 7 different ways that churches have been formed with life transformation groups. So I'll give you 2, all right? The most predominant 2. One is like I just described. I lead someone to Christ. I start discipling them in an LTG. Their life changes. The people around them recognize that, and he leads them or she leads them to Jesus, and they get in a life transformation group, and it multiplies until they have enough people to gather together in a home, which is very natural. And then they're meeting as a church, but those groups and those evangelism is still happening in other contexts in oikos, and they start to multiply. That's one way. Or I come to a group and lead someone to Jesus, and we baptize them, and everybody from their oikos comes to the baptism, and they say, this is real, and they accept Jesus, and boom, a church has started before I have time to do one LTG. And then we just say, hey, well, let's meet, here are the cards, everybody start an LTG, and pick someone that you feel comfortable with that's of your same gender. And so you've started a church first, and then you're doing LTGs. So it can go either way. The first story greenhouse, which is going to be this weekend here in Melbourne, and there's another one in the peninsula, Bellarine Peninsula, at the same time that Ed will be leading. That will explain exactly how to start a church using these groups. The key is we're not starting churches, we're making disciples. And churches happen more naturally because disciples are made. Does this help you?
Yep.
Yep.
So that's just a byproduct, really, of discipleship. They want to get together and
It really is. It should be a byproduct of disciples. You know, it should be, as you make disciples. I mean, when you came to Christ, and if some of you came to Christ a little later in life, you came to Christ, it was so exciting. Didn't you want to hang out with other people that were also excited about the same thing? You didn't have somebody say, now you have to meet with Christians. I found, you know, I actually told you this story. I wanted them to meet every other week. And they said, no way, we want to meet every day. I did not have to tell them to be church. They told me the way church looks. It was what they wanted. Now, you may not call it church. There's some context where I suggest you don't call it church. Because the populace, even though they may not even be Christians, have a preconceived idea what church is. And the moment you say, I'm starting a church, that's what they think. So just let it naturally be a Jesus family, a spiritual community, a faith community, that's the language a lot of people use. Eventually, they meet enough times, you could probably in the group say, this is what church really is, and they'll all say yes. And you skipped this whole discussion of ecclesiology that you don't need to do. Yeah.
Just going back to the 2 to 3, in the existing church and how you said, you know, just throw it open there and you know, encourage it, don't contrive it. If you've got a really young, just a new Christian, but they're full of enthusiasm as you're talking about, and they've just got a heart to do this with someone else, and yet their knowledge is minimal, everything else, do you just let that go? You just let that happen? You know, I'm just thinking of different people that would want to do that and yet maybe not have the maturity or, yeah.
You can let people go a lot easier knowing that they're in a life transformation group. So for instance, see, even brand new Christians meeting together, we read, this is the way a life transformation group works, is they read 20 to 30 chapters of scripture a week. So we pick a book of the Bible and we read that whole book. If it's Ephesians, which is 5 chapters, we read it, or 6 chapters, we read it 5 times in a week. And then when we get together, if someone didn't finish the reading, we read it again 5 times. So when I know they're reading Acts every single week, and when they're done, they start reading Luke every single week, I know they're getting grounded. I don't have to give them a Bible study. I don't have to teach them theology. They're hearing directly from God in His Word. That gives me a lot of confidence. They're also confessing their sins to one another. So there's a cleansing going on. There's a purifying, a preparing of their heart for the Word that we usually don't have in our Bible reading programs. And they're also identifying people that don't know Christ and praying for their souls. All of that gives me confidence to let them go on a long leash, knowing that they're still connected in the most important ways.
Can I just say Gail's going to Greenhouse over the weekend, so she will hear a lot more about that.
Yep.
And it's probably an opportune time to plug Greenhouse Festival Space on Bellarine and Richmond. And the Greenhouse Manual is 57 pages long, unlike the one that's being developed. And this is what
I created the Greenhouse Manual, not this one. So, yeah, it's a little better. Still out of date.
All the time, so you'll actually get heaps of this. And I say that not just for you, but for any people who are in your churches or in your families where you think, gee, this would be fantastic, let's send them along to it. Speak to Tim or Pete or to me if you would like to send people who are registered and free.
Good.
Yeah.
So let me just do this one part and we'll take a break, all right? I want to talk about network theory. There's a whole lot of books available on network theory now, whereas there didn't used to be. And there's 2 reasons for this: Al-Qaeda and the internet.
Yeah.
And so, whereas it used to be very few, and network theory used to be a small discipline within the whole genre of mathematics, but today, network theory is in every domain. So you read about it in technology, it's true in sociology, it's true in psychology, it's true in every single area. So it's just taken off. Now, it used to be that in 1972, someone wrote a paper mentioning 4 different kinds of networks. In spite of all the publications that have come out since then, there's still just 4 kinds of networks. 2 of them are relevant for our discussion and 2 are not. These are the 2 that are not. A dyad. Now, in network theory, this circle is called a node, and this line is called an edge. So an edge connects nodes, right? This is the most basic form of network. It's called a dyad. I don't call it a network. I call it a start. I'm hoping it will become more than just 2. The second kind is an all-channel network, where every node is connected to every node by an edge. Now, this is not relevant to us, even though you might think that's ideal. I would love to see that. The truth is that's far too many personal connections for people to maintain beyond 3. So if you want an all-channel network, you can do it with 3 house churches, but you're never going to get 4. There's too many lines of communication and relationships for any human to maintain. So an all-channel network is really only relevant for technology in some respects. But in technology, it is true. A hub can be connected to every hub. But that's a whole different thing. There's no personal relationships involved. So this is far too fragile and impossible to maintain. I'm giving this to you just so that you know I've done my homework. Here are the 2 networks that are relevant for our discussion. The first is a decentralized network. It's called a chain. Boop, 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 boop. There it is. So it's decentralized in that it's spreading out in different directions as a chain, and every node is self-sufficient, self-propagating, reproducing, going in all different directions, kind of like that video of the beer commercial where they're all spreading in different directions. And normally, this person here, who starts the church network, may or may not even know about the existence of these churches. It's decentralized. The second is a hub or star network that looks like this, and this is more centralized. And this is probably, in churchianity, what you're most accustomed to. And it is just as organic, it's just as alive. It is a network of churches. Which is better? There is no answer to that. They're both good for different things. They both have advantages and disadvantages that I'd like to talk about. All right? So here are the advantages of being decentralized. A decentralized network, the chain, has more rapid reproduction. So if you want to see a fast movement that spreads through an entire region, nation, or even the world, decentralized is the way to go. My network is, Awakening Chapels, is as extremely decentralized as I think you can get. And it's good we have Ed here, because Ed gives you the example of the more centralized hub. So rapid reproduction is true with decentralization. When you're centralized, to start another centralized church requires a higher level of leadership and oftentimes even cost, things like that. So it's slower to reproduce. It reproduces, but it takes longer. Decentralized network has impact on the globe much faster, where people can be all over the world really quickly. Our network, we started in Long Beach, but within just a few years, we had a church planter in San Francisco. We had another one in Salt Lake City. We had another one move to Portland. We had one in Paris. We had one in Indiana. So we started having impact, and that church in Indiana sends someone to Arizona, another one to Seattle, and that church in Indiana sends somebody to Chiang Mai, and another one to India. Third generation, fourth generation. And I lost count after that. So that's decentralized. Global impact much faster. Now, a centralized can have global impact, but it takes longer for them to get it going. It costs less to do decentralized. In fact, it can cost nothing. We don't even take an offering anymore. We started, because we're Christians, we took an offering. Because that's what church does. We decided to have a box. And everybody can just contribute to the box anytime they felt like it. We changed homes to an office complex and then back to another home, and after a few years, and somehow we lost the box and nobody noticed. We realized we have no need for a budget because we have no expenditures. So instead of taking an offering, we just had people become generous and give to any need they saw, to whatever they felt they needed to give to, and eliminated the middleman of the local church as this distribution point. Now, I know some of you that you're not going to be comfortable with that. You might not be in a chain network. I get that. But for me, we just realized, let's just make people generous. And that's all that's needed. Everyone will meet one another's needs. And so they're generous in a lot of ways. Sometimes they'll have someone live with them for an entire year with free of rent. That is giving. You can't write it off on your taxes, but it's generous. Give people a car. I've seen that happen. Pay for their transmission getting repaired. I've seen that happen. That's generosity. That's as much giving as someone who puts a check in the offering plate as it goes by. So it costs that we don't have rent, we don't have salaries, we don't have advertising, we don't have to buy a sound system, we don't have to upkeep the nature of the building. All that stuff's eliminated, and it frees us up. God is the obvious author. If it's going to reproduce 4, 5, 6, 10 generations, you are not doing that. You can't. If you're this chain, you're not running alongside each node making sure it stays right. So God actually gets maybe a little bit more of the, how should I say this? God gets more of the credit for a decentralized network. Whereas when you are centralized, human engineering is more obvious. Not necessarily bad. God can get glorified with both. In a decentralized network, you are more resistant to persecution. In fact, when persecution comes, everyone decentralizes, or they die. Those are your options. Now, the counterintuitive advantage to decentralized, that you may not get at first, but I'll explain it to you, is a decentralized network is more resistant to heresy. You've been trained by the teacher gift for centuries, for job security, that you must be centralized in order for you to keep heresy at bay. And the more out of control we get, the more obviously heresy is going to take over. That's what you've been told for centuries. That's actually the opposite of the truth. The more flat you become, the more it's distributed. If you have a heretic pop up, he doesn't have influence over very many people. Or she. I don't want to pick on just the guys. Girls have equal opportunity for heresy. So the more flat you are, actually, the more resistant to heresy you become. In fact, where there are heresies in, say, house church movements in China, they build a hierarchy to maintain their heretical doctrines, to control them. You can't control a flattened, decentralized network. So it's actually more resistant to heresy. The building of the hierarchy to control doctrine actually makes people more vulnerable to heresy, not less. Because suddenly now we rely on others, experts, to do our thinking for us, and whatever they say, we buy into. And it creates a dumber congregation, oftentimes, that is not equipped to handle heresy. And if you get the scholars on the top off base, everyone else follows suit. I once was asked by my denomination to serve on a panel to rethink licensure and ordination for our pastors. And so I'm with a guy who's a scholar in our movement, who's also on this panel. And I said, well, why don't we, the church, we say the church must license them. We just recommend the licensure. That's the way we work. Why don't we let the church do the examining? He said, oh no, we can't let the church examine their doctrine. They would never be competent enough to examine theology in someone. So I said, hey, I won't say his name. Hey, Paul, let's just say his name's Paul. Paul, how long have you been at your church? And he gets kind of proud. He says, I've been there 25 years. So I said, you mean to tell me you've been teaching every week for 25 years and the people you're teaching are not equipped to determine good doctrine from bad? What's wrong with your teaching? He got kind of quiet. I said, seriously, do you think now suddenly if one of those people goes off to school for 3 years, now they're fit to understand doctrine, whereas 25 years of your teaching, they're not? See, that's the problem. When we build this hierarchy where we have experts at the top, but we must rely upon them, it creates a dumber group underneath. It really does. They don't think for themselves. So when you flatten it out, they have to think for themselves, or there's no thinking going on at all. All right? Any questions on that so far? Yeah, go ahead.
Just on the decentralised, I understand what you're saying about that. Who decides who will lead the next group along, if you like? Am I understanding it correctly? This group would then say, I think we need a group in, Illinois or
right.
Is that how it works? And how do you reckon who's actually going to start that group?
Good, yeah. Normally, the ideal is the Holy Spirit puts the burden on a person who says, I love my friend is over there, they're hurting, they need Jesus, and all those people need Jesus, I'd like to go. And the church says, well, we feel that's the Holy Spirit, lay hands on them and send them. That's normally how it works for us. Or someone comes to you and says, I work for TRW, they're closing, or I work for Ford plant, they're closing it down, and I'm getting a job with Toyota over in Perth. And so we say, okay, well, that's obviously God's moving you. Let's pray that He leads you to a group of people that are open and you start a church, and we send them off as a church planter. Those are the ways it works.
So, in my experience, and I've just been thinking about this the past few years in more detail, and we'll be more deliberate about it, but we are more of a hub kind of a situation where there's a center and we all come together weekly, but there's all these groups around. But I started thinking about all the churches that we've started, and none of them have become hubs. They've all become chains. Every one of them. Some are 2 chains, some are 4 chains, some are unknown chains. But they've all been chains. I thought it's very interesting. I'm not even sure why that is yet. But now we're deliberately sending out people and not telling them to do hubs. Or in the past, I wanted them to do hubs. But I want them now to experience what God has for them. So we've just sent a group to Boston because their job changed, just like Neil said. Their jobs changed, and they're starting. They have one church currently with the idea of starting more, and there's one guy that I've been discipling that he's going to start. He has an idea to start a church via Craigslist, find some broken people, put them in LTGs, and send them out. That's just what he feels he wants to do. So I say, go try that experiment, see what happens. Doesn't sound like something I would do, but why not try it? So it's very interesting to me how a hub has started all these chains. When I really wanted them to be hubs, they never became. And it just, so if you have a hub situation, and probably most of you are more hub-esque than chain-esque, there's ways that you can do that and see multiple generations go out. They won't be connected to you, there won't be money flowing or resources flowing to or from, but they can impact a greater area with you just being connected to them, with only the first one, obviously.
Now, I have theories about what he's talking about. I don't have tangible scientific data on this yet, but here's my theory. One of the things we've noticed, and this is just through experience, is that we've never seen a chain become a hub. Not once. In 15 years of doing it this way. Not once. But we do see hubs launching chains, like he says, all the time. My theory is, what it takes to actually produce this kind of reproduction will work against becoming centralized. And that if you are centralized, but you're doing disciple making the way we are with DNA and stuff, it launches multiplicative chains. So we've not ever seen a chain become a hub, but we've seen lots of hybrids that are hubs becoming chains, where this one starts multiplying in chains and so on and so forth. This is the experience we've had. We don't have the scientific data to tell you why, just theories. But
would a normal-looking church with a strong network of small groups be considered a hub?
Say it again?
Would a normal-looking church meets every Sunday with a strong network of small groups?
Yeah, that's a hub.
You would consider that?
That's a hub. Yeah, in network theory, that would be a hub.
For most churches probably represented here, the center is the more important element, typically. And we're a little bit different as a hybrid. Our most important element is the LTG. If I had to rank them, the second element would be the outside circle, and then the least important would be the center, which we meet every week on.
Which is why I think they've started chains instead of hubs. Because he's placed that value in the product of this ministry, the disciple and the leader gets that the LTG and this family unit is more important than the centralized one, and when it starts multiplying, they let it go.
Have you seen that in expressing people's level of commitment? So do you find that people still want to put most of their energy into the centre node?
For me, no.
In your network, you know what I mean?
No. If I had to put a percentage, it's 2 at the most, 10, 12% that have ever only come to Sunday night and never did an LTG or house church.
But there's a higher percentage in the house churches than come.
Always.
Yeah,
There's
always.
people I never meet or rarely meet or don't really know anything about.
That are in part of their house churches that don't come to the centralized
What about
gathering.
representation of the numbers? If you said your network is 150 people or something, what percentage of those people would come to that middle?
Oh, that's a good one. So we have 100 to 120 maybe, in our whole network. And if you showed up on one Saturday night, you might find 25, you might find 70, but never more than 70.
Okay.
And it's usually more like 40.
But he has also gone on a journey to be less centralized than when he started. So their Sunday gathering used to be what did you say? Pray, preach, sing. But today, they'll say, let's have a picnic in the park this Sunday.
Right.
Next week, let's go prayer walking down Phoenix in the city. Next Sunday, let's go paint this widow's house for her. And next week, let's pray, preach, sing. So he has intentionally moved to decentralize the importance of that gathering, but the gathering is still there for when they need to cast vision or do training, that kind of thing on a regular basis. Not everyone's done that, and so there are others that are, where it's more. The most centralized network I've seen of organic churches is Xenos Christian Fellowship in Columbus, Ohio. It's a church that started with 3 college students at Ohio State University that met for, like an LTG, for accountability, and then their lives were growing and changing, and they began to reach others, and they started groups meeting in dormitories and fraternities, and this started to expand. And these 3 have pastored this church that's now a mega church in numbers, that has multiple acres and a state-of-the-art building. And you go on Sunday, and there's no music. And they're not Church of Christ people. They don't even sing a cappella. There is no music, and they'll stand up and say, if you're looking for worship, that's done in the church, and the church is in your home. This is the teaching of the apostles, and they just do an instructional time. It's a very unusual church. And most of these house churches all around Columbus, and this has been going on for decades now, are all people who've come to Christ from the gospel. But you will never find another Xenos in another state or another place, another city. They can't reproduce what they have. In fact, there's still 3 people on staff and no one's in charge. They have acres of property with this state-of-the-art building, and they still share an office together. It's a kind of unique relationship you can't reproduce very easily. But it's a beautiful expression of the kingdom in a very centralized format. So,
yeah, I was just going to reinforce that, because we started just by making disciples, and it's kind of turned into a hub. But some of those that have gone off on and started a decentralized chain, and it makes sense because the community they're engaged in is completely foreign to our community.
Right.
So it would be silly for them to come back to us because it just makes no sense. So it's making sense in their own world.
And the reason I'm decentralized is I tried to centralize, and the Lord said, let the indigenous church tell you what it's supposed to be like. And it was God leading us to be decentralized. And so once I figured that, I pushed the envelope to be decentralized, where I don't have control over any of these churches we send off. And they're all over the world, and I couldn't count them if I wanted to. 5 years in, I did. But after 5 years, it was too spread out to count. But after 5 years of doing it this way, we counted 75 churches meeting within 5 different networks. And we found a 5th generation reproduction where a church started a church, started a church, started a church, started a church. Now, counting that kind of thing gets really hard after that point. Even counting up to 5th generations is near impossible. So, but that's what we found. We were in 5 different parts of the world too.
So Neil, just to clarify, because the language, you slightly when you say church started the church, we're talking about households.
Households of faith. Yes.
12, 15 started.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I just, I just wanted to bring it back to the circumstance, some of us in that we have we already are involved in a traditional church. And I'm just thinking about the idea of the hub and small groups, because my heritage is all high groups and all that kind of stuff. And, you train up your leader, your small group leader, and, you get them to be missional and divide and all that. So, there's kind of this wrestling going on within me at the moment. I love what you're saying, and I'm trying to reframe some of that theory into what you're saying now. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about when you talk about, because some of our small groups we've got one small group that's got about 12 people in it, for example. So, it's like a church. So in a way, some of us have churches that have smaller churches operating. Yeah. And I'm thinking about what we were going to do next, which was to gather the leaders and to skill them up and to, call forth the trumpet and all that kind of stuff. But I think what you're saying is, what I'm hearing you saying, what I'm wrestling with is almost, applying some of these principles and just trusting them to actually listen to the Holy Spirit, like we were talking about before, you know. So, do you know where I'm at?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of what Christendom has been for centuries, and so everybody who's doing it has just inherited this idea, but it's trying to go backwards. Remember this slide? So we have a, here we go. We have a denomination that wants to start churches that recruits leaders to make disciples. And what you can church plant that way, you can't multiply movements that way. And so you don't find these kinds of churches spontaneously multiplying or starting movements that go all over the place. At best, you'll find an association of like-minded churches, but it's an addition strategy, not multiplication. And in the later part of today, that's what we're going to look at, the difference between addition and multiplication.
Neil, I think behind Gail's question, if you go back to that slide, if you don't mind.
This one I just am at?
Yeah, is the fact that, at our greenhouse LTGs and so on, we're talking disciples moving up, whereas that church transfusion, we're in the green space. We're saying, okay, we've got these long-established churches which aren't necessarily making disciples anymore. They're not effective in terms of mission.
Yep.
What do we do to transfuse them? So that for me is the key question for the pastors who are gathered here today.
So here's some suggestions for you right away. All right, stop looking to recruit leaders. That's just a consumer mindset. I know. For most people, their leadership farm system begins with a committed Christian. And then what we got to do is teach them skills, knowledge, watch their character form to become leaders and send them out. I suggest you don't start with a committed Christian. Start with people who don't know Jesus. And the reason being is the impetus, the energy behind movements is transformation. If you start with already transformed people, you're starting without that energy. So start with lost people. Now, how many of you have lost people around your church? Sounds like you've got a ready-made harvest field waiting for leadership. Most churches that recruit leaders never have enough leaders. Is that not true? You always have more ministry than you have leaders. And the reason is, you're shopping for leaders. You're not making them. The reason you're not making them is you're not making disciples. Discipleship starts with lost people. So start looking at the people around you that don't know Christ. Bring them the gospel. When their life is changed, set them loose from day one to have influence. It may not be that they're ready to start taking over an adult Bible study, but they might start something with their peers. So start with disciples with obedience-oriented training, not just knowledge, and you'll start to see leaders emerge that are of a different caliber than what you're used to, and they are not likely to start filling the slots, but catalyzing new things.
Amen.
Which is better, actually. So I would suggest you stop. Any of you like bananas? Yep. All right. Where do you get your bananas? The shop, right? Does anybody here grow their own bananas? All right. Well, this is the first time in my life of traveling the world that someone said they grow their own bananas. Everyone else, if you ask my kids when they were little, if you say where do bananas come from, they would say the grocery store, the shop. Because that's where we get our bananas. We're all consumers of bananas and no one's a producer. Welcome to church. No one's producing leaders. We're all recruiting them. We're going looking for them. We need to start being producers of leaders.
Or we expect the seminaries to produce leaders, which is not the kind of thing that we want.
Where do the seminaries get the candidates to produce from the churches? It's a vicious circle that doesn't help itself. So we all have to start producing leaders by making disciples of lost people. And there's always a church in town that's doing that. And they are never at a want for leadership. And they are actually probably providing leadership for a lot of other churches in the area, whether it's intentional or not. because they're making disciples of lost people. If we all took our leadership farm system and just expanded it to start with lost people. Go ahead, Tim.
Just in practical application, I assume you probably go here, so we don't want to steal thunder too much, but listening to this conversation, I'm running an existing church and yet on the side seeing some come to faith. And you've got to be really deliberate about working out here. And then you've got to not put the expectations of that person coming back in and serving here. That's one of the real juggling acts that I've personally experienced. But this is being very fruitful, more fruitful than this. So I just deliberately put an hour or two into that every week. And to that person or two, knowing that I'm prepared in my head that this is not going to grow my church, do you know what I mean? But it might start something new. And that's a wrestle in there. It's going to take some wrestling.
If you don't mind, I just want to run through this real quick and then we'll break.
But it is too.
These are the advantages of being
Growing your church.
centralized. All right? Advantage of being centralized is you have better communication. You can actually say, hey, everybody, such and such is sick, pray. Or let's all converge on this place to pick up trash in the park. And you can actually communicate with everybody in your network. I can literally be standing behind someone in line at the shop who's part of my network and we not know it. I've had awesome times where I've bumped into somebody and found out later they were part of our network. But that's because I'm decentralized. You have faster regional impact when you're centralized, where you can mobilize larger groups of people to attend to a need in a region. Let's all focus on cleaning trash in the park or feeding the homeless, that kind of thing. So you have impact quicker on a region. Now, I'll have impact with a decentralized network, but it will take years before we get there. You have pooled resources where you can all contribute to a pocket or to a fund to send somebody someplace, to buy something for somebody. You pool resources together. However, it costs more to be centralized because you're going to have some. If you're going to meet together, you're going to have some hall large enough for everybody. There's going to be rent. You're probably going to need a higher caliber of leader to pull all these people together. More visible presence. You might even have an address. People can even find you. If you came to Long Beach and said, I'm going to go find an Awakening Chapel, good luck. There's no advertising. We don't have an address. We meet in a home. Sometimes we change to another home. Sometimes we go back. Sometimes we don't. If you don't know somebody, you will not find us. It's just impossible. So you can actually have, people can talk about the church that comes from that place. And then you have longevity of the churches. If you are a network, a hub, and one of the churches becomes very weak for some reason, the other churches can be a supportive network to keep it up until it gets back on its feet. With a chain network, you don't have that support. So both are good, both are bad. You have to choose which disadvantage you're willing to live with. And there are hybrids in between, but like I said, the hybrids always go from centralized to decentralized. It usually doesn't go the other way. Let's take a break. The likelihood is, if you're at Church Transfusion, oh, I'm sorry, David, you want to say something? Yeah, of course. It's important. It's more important.
Well, that was a question. I'm actually booked into the same place for about 25, but some aren't here. And some didn't go yesterday, so I just want the restaurant will be calling me soon to get a take on numbers for this afternoon. Who would like to go back to the place we were at?
That was awesome.
Good choice. All in favour, say aye. Thank you.
All right, and the others not? Okay, so it's fair idea. I've got the numbers.
You're welcome.
The other thing is just over the break, it was lovely to be part of 3 minutes of conversations. And there were lots of questions which have arisen, particularly around the transfusion. I wonder if there might be some value in making sure that you write down the particular questions you've got, and over lunch we might kind of compile them to make sure that they're actually addressed in that answer.
Sure.
Is that okay?
It's intimidating, but yes.
So just one down to bring together.
Yeah, write down your questions. Pool them. and Tim will be happy to answer all of your questions. Good. All right. Well, here, let me just make some assumptions. If you're here at Church Transfusion, you are probably in a hub church of some sort. You may be in a congregational church that doesn't even have the other nodes. It's just the one node. So the likelihood of you suddenly becoming decentralized is probably slim, but I still want you to understand the differences, the advantages. There are some advantages that you have that the chain I have, I don't have that advantage, and those are the ones right there. Now, the other side is, when you see those concentric circles of groupings, you probably can identify, we've got this one, maybe we have this one, and then you probably have a lot of those size groupings you don't have. Let me just suggest that you take them all into consideration, but your priority is in the 2 or 3 groups, that you start making disciples. When you do that, start with desperate, lost people. They could be church members, but they're desperate. They need transformation. If you start with people that don't need transformation, they will not take it seriously.
But let me add something just real quick. I did that mistake early on, with especially one guy. He wasn't desperate, and we're going to unpack all we're talking about. But so I kind of said, you know, you're going to be an LTG, and you're going to be an LTG, and they did it. And they immediately changed. I won't say what they did. I'll tell the rest of that story later. They immediately changed what we had suggested them to do, and it didn't work. And so, guess what he became the known for? The guy that says LTGs don't work. And he had a lot of influence, and so a lot of people, and there's still some people that are connected to us that still have that bad taste. So it really, I just cannot overemphasize. Don't make it a program for everybody. Never do that, because it won't work. Because once the program stops, you can never restart it with the same feel anyways. Always start with the most desperate people. If you don't have, if none of your people are desperate, then go out in the streets and find people that are desperate. That's what you need to do, and watch something build outside of that. We'll probably chat more about that, but I can't emphasize enough. Hear me clear, hear deal clear. Don't start with people unless they're desperate. So
one of the things in my backyard, we have grass, and much of it died. Now it's called St. Augustine grass, which doesn't grow from seeds up, it grows sideways. Sends off runners and plants, and so that's the way this grass grows. So when it's dead, you don't water the brown dead stuff. You water the green spot and let it grow until eventually the grass becomes green. In your church environment, there is some life somewhere. That's where you pour your resources. And I don't mean money. Sometimes pouring money to something will mess it up. Or, how do you say it? Muck it up. Yeah. So pour your time, your care, your affections, your mentoring, pour that stuff, your giftedness into that green spot and let it have influence that spreads. And that's what we're going to talk about until lunch, and then we'll take a break. So when it comes to watering the green spots, we recommend that if you're going to bring change to your organization, you start a skunk works operation. Do you guys know what the term skunk works is? Good. Let me explain it to you.
Stinky.
Skunk works has become a business term, but it didn't start that way. In World War II, the smart people knew that it was really, World War II was a race for technology. And whoever got the best technology fastest would win this war. And that came true, right? And we all are indebted to Norway for keeping the Nazis from getting the, what's the kind of water they use? Heavy water. And nobody knows the story, but it's a wonderful story, so that the U.S. would develop the atomic bomb first. I know none of us like atomic bombs, but anyway, it was a race for technology. Now, the problem we ran into was that all of our engineers that were working on our technology all went to the same schools, had the same professors, read the same books, and were producing the same product. Welcome to church, right? So what they decided was, Lockheed decided, we're going to separate our most creative engineers from the pack. And they built a tent at the end of a runway in Burbank, California, and they put them in the tent and they said, we want you to think outside the box, come up with wild and crazy ideas. You don't have to go through the bureaucracy. You don't have to get permission. Just do it. And this tent on the runway was next to a plastics factory that smelled bad, and it became known as Skunk Works. Most of the modern technology that we use all the time, a lot of it came from this Skunk Works operation. Even to this day, Skunk Works has produced things like smart bombs and stealth technology and things. And one of the reasons we advanced in World War II was because of Skunk Works. Now, Skunk Works is something that businesses utilize, where they become stuck in the mode of producing the same thing all the time. So some businesses have started projects on the side called Skunk Works that produce something else. Some of the most incredible innovations, like the Apple computer, was developed in a garage as a Skunk Works project. Or Toshiba, the first laptop computer, was a Skunk Works project, but Toshiba did not give permission to it. They didn't like the idea. They said no. It was official. This is a Japanese company. So when they say no, they mean no. And somebody knew that this was the breakthrough that they needed. So on his own, he created a laptop computer, and Toshiba has been successful ever since. Skunk Works are usually innovative, smaller pockets of people thinking outside the box, don't have to live by the same rules. The Skunk Works, the original Skunk Works with Lockheed and Lockheed Martin eventually, they did not even have to sign contracts. They just did the job with a handshake. It was spontaneous, it was rapid, they could move to something as quickly as they needed to. They could move their creative, innovative engineers on a subject immediately, brainstorm, come up with an idea, implement it. They did not have to run through all the chain of command and the bureaucracy. So I think if you want to bring transformation to an existing church, start a Skunk Works operation on the side. So let me give you some insights into how to go about doing that. First of all, the senior leadership of the church needs to personally be invested in the Skunk Works operation. They have to own it in a sense. They have to feel its importance so that they protect it, so that they talk about it, and so that they encourage and bless it. But also, they shouldn't get in the way. Now, it may be you're talking about a senior pastor. It may be you're talking about a board of, there are some churches that are led by deacon boards. And the senior pastor, it comes and goes every year and a half. Whoever the senior leadership is, they have to buy into this idea of a Skunk Works. If it is a senior pastor, usually that senior pastor thinks they're innovative, and they probably are not. If they were innovative, they would have innovated already. Right? So I'm not saying they have to lead the Skunk Works project. It's probably better that for them and for the Skunk Works that they don't lead it, but that they support it. That they mentor the people leading it in a godly and releasing way, but they do not have to be the one in charge of it. All right? That's an important thing.
Does that mean that they need to be involved in the actual Skunk Works?
Yeah.
Because I've actually seen a situation where that would be sabotaged by that person, either directly or indirectly, because of their mindset.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. If you are the senior pastor, probably don't get your hands all over it. But if you do, here's the thing. If you don't have some level of commitment to it, you will start something new, you won't transfuse your church. This subject is not about starting something new. That's what we talk about over the weekend. This subject is transforming an existing church. In order for that to happen, the senior leadership has to value what's happening in the skunk works, let it happen, and somehow let the influence of that skunk works enter into the church. So that's why I say, yeah, don't lead it, maybe not even be on the leadership team, don't go to the meetings, don't even get involved in it, just simply have a channel so you hear the stories, you hear what's going on, and you report back to the church in a positive way. And when people take issue with it, they want to attack it, you step in the way and block for it. That's what I'm suggesting for the senior leadership.
So that church I was talking about in Atlanta, that's exactly what happened. This guy was reading the stuff that we'd written, wanted to own it with the missions, had me come out and do some training. I met with the senior pastor. I told him the importance of him blessing this guy, doing all these new things, because he, just trying to set the groundwork for him. He agreed to all of it. He stepped out of the missions completely, let my friend, the guy that's now my friend, run with it. And he does the blocking, just like he said. And there's people that say, how come we're not supporting this guy anymore? How come we're not supporting that guy anymore? Why is this changing? He blocks it and gives permission to release this guy, this missions leader, all over the world. So, and he's also sold his house. He bought these principles so much, he sold his house, moved into an apartment complex, and started a bunch of churches and LTGs with Indian people that have transferred, to the United States to live and work.
The senior pastor did, or the
No,
mission
the
pastor?
missions guy, yeah. And so he's doing it on both levels. He's seeing two different things happen, both internationally and locally, with the permission and the blocking ability of the senior pastor to make the way go smoother. So there's just a quick story that talks to exactly what we're saying here.
Start with the right people in your Skunkworks project. Look for innovative people. People who are creative, people that are entrepreneurial, people that will take risks, people that think outside the box. They don't just think the way things have been, but they think the way things can be. That's the kind of person you want to start with in your Skunkworks operation. If you saddle this down with people who are not innovators, you're not going to change anything. Right? Oftentimes they will be younger. They don't have to be. There are innovative older people, and you might have a mixture, but you'll probably attract more younger people in a Skunkworks operation than elderly. Okay? Keep it secret, keep it safe, like the ring of power, for the first phases of your development. Don't announce to the church, we've started a new ministry that's going to be different and going to change everything that you know about church. That's probably going to backfire in your face. You don't want, in the early stages where it is most vulnerable, people attacking it. So my suggestion is you let the Skunkworks project go for a time without a lot of attention from the church. Let it be a pilot project that's protected for a time. Once it gets on its feet, it probably will be less vulnerable. I remember I was afraid to announce to my denomination the results we were seeing, for fear everyone would come and see what we were doing, and our church would be full of people who aren't excited. And then we'd also have a case where brand new Christians will defer to these more mature, knowledgeable Christians, and everything get derailed. So in the first year or so, I didn't tell anybody what was going on. Then word got out. I said, oh, well, it must be of the Lord. Let's let them find out. And we started having all these visitors. We had interns come. But by that point, these Christians were strong enough, these new Christians, that they were not deterred by the others. But I did keep it secret for a while. It actually worked interesting. There's a story to tell. We had a group of Christians from a Midwest Christian college and wanted to come to Awakening and visit and see what was going on. And it was during a time I was going to be in Europe doing training. So I said, sure, you can come. Here's where you can meet up with these people. Here's a phone number and so on. So they went and visited while I was away. I came back and I met with my team that we were making disciples, and every one of them has come to Christ out of the harvest field. They all have backgrounds, they all had tats, they all had piercings, they all smoked cigarettes still, and they were all telling everybody that they could about Jesus. So I met with them, and I said, hey, so tell them, we figured let's get them off methamphetamine first. We'll worry about nicotine later. So we're meeting with them, and I said to them, so how was that time when these Christians came? And one of the girls, this is her exact words, she said, well, you know what? That was the first time I ever met some real Christians. That was her language. And I said, well, what did you think of real Christians? She said, So they weren't going to deter her from her mission. She knew Jesus. She was all about Jesus. And they weren't going to influence her in that way. Here's where the story gets funny, though. I spoke at that Christian college that winter. And when they heard I was going to be there, these same leaders said, can we take you to breakfast? I said, sure. We went out to breakfast. We sat at the table. You know what these guys said to me? That was the first time we met real Christians. That was their exact language. The same. I said, what did you think? He says, it was awesome. So after the Skunk Works project gets on its feet, the people feel like God's got their backs, that there's wind at their sails, it's okay to tell the rest of the church. But prior to that, there's a vulnerability that you don't want to get sidetracked. You don't want to get distracted by things that are unnecessary. So keep it a pilot project on the side that people don't know about. Keep it secret, keep it safe for the beginning.
So for some of you senior leaders, here's what one of the guys on our team did. He learned all this over a decade ago. He learned all these things, took his elders away for a weekend retreat. I still have his syllabus. I can still see it on my desk with a red cover on it. And he took all his elders through the whole weekend and thought this is going to be great. They're going to really get this. This is going to be fantastic. And it wasn't so. You had the paid price for about 3 years of dealing with all the reverberations.
Talking about Phil?
Yeah.
Yeah, Phil's the co-author on this book, right. Church Transfusion, with me.
You learned from real life experience.
His first attempt was he said, I'm going to start the change at the top with the elders. So he brought the elders, downloaded all the information, and you know what one of them said? He says, you know what? I wouldn't want to go to a church like that. And so it didn't work. 3 years later, there's turnover. People leave. There's others who come in. The people who came in were he had, hand chosen. They were influencers. They were different. And so he did eventually see the change. But we're telling you, start with desperate people on the side that are innovators. Don't start with the people that aren't going to innovate.
The other thought that I do have, though, in an existing church, rather than saying, look, we're going to start a whole new structure and a whole new way of being.
Exactly.
That doesn't go down.
No.
But the idea of meeting 2 or 3 people as discipleship, wow, now you're talking church language, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, I hope so.
You can do that.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Except that even that would terrify and get some people here in the existing church offside.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why yeah, and those are not the people you want in your LTG. So the next line is, let the rest go as usual.
Yeah.
Let them have Sunday morning, let them have a sermon, let them have a choir or a worship service or whatever you want to call it. Let them have Wednesday night potluck or whatever you normally do. Let it happen as usual. As the pilot project on the side does something creative, innovative, and different.
The other was just said here that I'm doing both at the moment, and things like the LTG, there's no reason why all the church can't do that. Now, I don't insist on it as a program, but in the existing structured church, there's a lot of people that do that. So that's kind of values.
Yeah. So you can implement, by the way, you can implement LTGs across the board. It doesn't have to be restricted to a Skunk Works. Yeah. Although, when you're doing Skunk Works, make sure that people are doing disciple making.
Yes.
LTGs. But let the rest go as usual. You can start introducing concepts like we talked about yesterday. You can do a sermon series on what it means to die for Christ and live for Christ, and start pointing out all these passages and even asking the questions. I'm asking myself, maybe we can ask together, what does it mean for our church, for us as a people, to die to ourselves? And then eventually at the end of the service, have that memorial service and then a baby shower. And then the next week, you might still meet, but you might then introduce, by the way, this is what God's been birthing. And that might be a time to start telling them what is going on in the skunk works, if it's got its feet under it. I'm just throwing out ideas. I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm telling you, giving you options. But let it get some strength before you start painting a target on it. Provide blocking for the new stuff. When people start hearing about it and they say, hey, look what they're doing, and this is bad, and this is wrong, and this is what they said, and step in between. Try to keep that stuff from the innovators on the ground who are actually doing it. As long and as much as you can, keep that distraction from them. Step in between. You guys have blocking, right? You guys with rugby and all that. A lot of context, they don't have football, and so I have to explain what blocking means. But you just get in the way and make sure that they can run with the ball. All right? So receive the complaints yourself rather than letting it go to them. And when you do, offer kindness. Say, I understand those concerns. I've even had some of them myself. I understand. I just feel like God's telling us, let this go for a while. He may answer those concerns. I know these people, they're in accountable relationship with me, I'm meeting with them regularly, and I guarantee you I'm not going to let this go off the deep end. That kind of thing will set them at ease. Some of them. Not all of them. And sometimes they're not going to let you block. Sometimes the attack makes the skunk works stronger, so you can't protect it from everything. But especially in the earlier vulnerable days, you want to try and block as much as you can. Let it start off campus. That's just good counsel. Let them think outside the box. In order to do that, get outside the box. Don't meet in the box. Meet somewhere else. Let them think of church out there instead of in here. Because once you put them in this environment, even if their thoughts are about what we do out there, it's going to be influenced by these four walls. Or even just the atmosphere, the spirit inside these four walls. Let them go someplace where the spirit's different, where the ideas are different, where they can think outside of this box. All right? So I suggest that they start whatever they're doing outside of the church campus. Now, once it gets going, if they want to use the church campus for an event, that's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. But the innovative side, the brainstorming, the context for the ministry, let it be out on the streets instead of in the seats. And don't try to force people to be motivated. Only run with those who want to run. Don't make people get involved with this. So if you have people in your church that are never going to be involved with the skunk works, don't force them to get involved with the skunk works. And that's why we say let church go as usual for those people. Now the truth is, you may lose people by doing this. Hey, you might lose people by not doing this. You probably will. So I don't think you should evaluate whether we do this or not by how many people we lose. It's real. There are more important issues than that. But I would say don't let people who aren't motivated dictate the way church is done. We talked about that yesterday. And then lastly, define the boundaries at the start. So if there are certain boundaries that they have to live under, let them know now. Don't let them know after they cross the boundary.
This is your Skunk Works team you're talking about?
Yep. The Skunk Works innovators out off the property, coming up with new ideas. If there are boundaries, and there usually are, let them know in advance. Don't let them cross the boundaries and get sledgehammered and then tell them about the boundaries. That's what I'm saying. Now, what is a boundary? Well, do they have to be of the denomination of your church? Whatever they birth. Do they have to attend on Sunday morning as well as what they're doing? Do they have to tithe if they're going to do this, or give? Do they have to, or the big boundaries are, can they baptize their own disciples, or do they have to have you baptize them? And if you baptize them, do they have to do it in the auditorium? Or can they do it at the river, or down at the beach? Can they have communion, or do you have to be there for communion? See, these are defined boundaries. Now, The truth is, the less boundaries, the better. None is best. But what if there's no boundary? What if they don't even have the gospel? Well, the gospel isn't meant to be a boundary. The gospel is meant to be inside of them. And if it's inside of them, you don't have to set a boundary. They carry it. So that's the problem. We tend to think of church as a corral. And it's my brothers that came from this place, Alan Hirsch and Mike Frost, really hit this home for me, the difference between a bounded set and a centered set. Because out in the outback, there's so much land that trying to keep all your cattle or whatever you have inside a fence, it costs too much to build a fence that big. So what they discovered is, let's just dig a well, and the cattle will pretty much stay where the water is. They're not going to venture far. That's a centered set approach as opposed to a fence. Now, Jesus did talk about this stuff. In John chapter 10, he talks about the difference between a fold, which is a bounded set, and a flock, which is a centered set. A fold looks like this. The shepherd will build 4 walls, one of them with an opening. That's the door. Jesus said, I am the door. He's the way in and way out. And when it's time for everyone to rest, he leads the flock into the bounded set, into the fold, where once they're in, they can wander around. They can do whatever they want. He doesn't have to keep an eye on them. And it delineates who's in and who's out. That's what bounded sets do. So what are some of those walls? Your denomination's doctrines. You could be a denomination that believes that women can't lead. All right? There's a doctrine that is passed down. And that may be a boundary you have to set. I hope not. The less boundaries, the better. But that's a type of boundary that a lot of churches have. Or another boundary is the one we talked about, baptism, that only pastors can baptize. There's a boundary. That's a form of doctrine that also translates to methods. Or it might be methods. It could be we have to have Sunday school, or we have to have Awana. These are the things that define who we are. You can tell who's in and who's out based on how they relate to the walls, the boundaries. Or traditions. We're used to that. All your churches have boundaries, right? Every one of them. That's the way we corral our people. That's the way we determine who's in and who's out. Now, a centered set approach is different. And he talks about a flock, where he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out of the fold, and they become one flock with one shepherd. They follow the shepherd's lead. So now it's not who's in and who's out. They're all out. It's a question of who's closer to the voice. And the further away you get from the voice, the more dangerous it becomes. But, that's not... the other alternative is put walls around everyone. Now, what happens if the flock stays in the fold all the time? They die. They starve to death. Yeah. So, and that's interesting. There's no demand for obedience inside the fold. So the voice of the shepherd is not really all that relevant. Once you get out of the fold, now the voice of the shepherd is life-giving. It's the most important thing. And I think all of us who have folds need to learn to lead people out to be a flock. To be centered set, focused, and being closer. So in your Skunkworks project, if you have to set boundaries, I'm not going to judge you on that. Set them up front. Let people know before they start. You can do a lot of things, but here's something you can't do. Here's something you can't do. Here's something you can't do. We can talk about it, but probably you can't do it. Now, I don't suggest that, but that may be the reality, the norm of your situation. Talk about it ahead of time. Don't wait till after they cross that boundary. I have a guy who I discipled that started a church youth group for a Presbyterian church, and he didn't know better. He came to Christ through us, got discipled through us, and so he just baptized these people that came to Christ in a Presbyterian church. He got in trouble for that. Nobody told him in advance he can't do that. So don't let that happen. Tell him in advance if that's the situation. Is there any questions on this?
Not a question. sentence said it's not just the sheep following the shepherd, but it's also in terms of proximity, but it's also direction.
Yeah.
So you might have some who might be closer to the shepherd, but who are not facing the other way. So in terms of who you choose, that fits in with what you were saying earlier. It's also the direction of travel.
Yeah.
Those who are traveling towards the shepherd.
So whoever you...
Might be close, but who are moving away.
Right, David. So whoever you encounter, the question isn't are they in or out. The question is, are you getting closer? Are you in the right direction?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might have said this, but how many is an optimum number for the skunk works?
We're going to cover that in a moment, but yeah, it should be growing.
Sorry?
It should be growing. So the question is, who do you start with? Now, it could be 2 or 3. It could be 12 or 15. Likelihood of it being more than that is probably not true. You don't want to hive off a large number of people in your skunk works, because then they're going to already inherit all the mechanisms that are keeping the church back are going to be in that other group. So what you're looking is to hand select innovators. Now, that said, that already defines how many it's going to be. Because according to Everett Rogers' book, The Diffusion of Innovation, there's only a limited percentage of any organization that are innovators. All right? And so this is from his book. The Diffusion of Innovation is a great book. It's about this thick. It's a great doorstop. But it's actually, it's very intimidating, but if you do read it, it is full of examples, full of content, full of data, and even stories, and it's not as hard to read as it looks from the outside. Everett Rogers, Diffusion of Innovation. It's not a Christian book, but it's got examples of Christian things inside it as well as non-Christian things. So in any organization, there are only 2.5% that are innovators. So if you want to know how many to start your Skunk Works project, look for the innovators, and probably it's going to be a small number to begin with, 2.5%. The next size grouping are called early adopters, and they are normally 13.5% of any organization. Early adopters. These are not the innovators. They don't come up with the ideas, but when they hear it, I like it. Let me be a part of it. They are still risk takers, but they aren't the creative types who come up with the ideas, but they will not only implement them, but share them with others and spread it. Sometimes the second person in the movement is the most important person. And that's the early adopter sometimes. Early majority is next, and that represents 34% of the organization. They will get in, they'll be the first group to, they're not early adopters, but when it starts going mainstream, these will be the first ones to say, hey, I like it, I'm going to surrender, let's do it, join it. And then there are the late majority, they will follow the early majority, and they represent 34%. And then there's one other group, 16% are laggards. Laggards will never buy in. They will be more vocal in the beginning, and then they'll get passive aggressive as the early adopters join in, or early majority. But they'll probably never change their mind. This is true for every organization. Now here's the good news, all right? A tipping point will occur. You guys know what a tipping point is? It's when there's enough energy and momentum behind this idea that it's unstoppable after that point. That tipping point occurs at 16%. So really what we're talking about is just getting the innovators and early adopters to buy in, the people that it's easiest to sell to. Just getting them, and the rest will eventually follow. And that's how you transfuse or diffuse innovation in an existing church. One life at a time, through starting with crazy, wild people that are willing to start something off campus without a lot of boundaries, and then, but you have to set up channels where that influence that they're making is somehow coming in, so that the early adopters can hear about it and join them. The problem is sometimes you do that, you sever the relationship and you start something new, but never transfuse what exists. And that's not what we're talking about here. So in order for, by the way, I'm in favor of that. Church planting is a great thing. I've given my life to it. However, we're talking about church transfusion, which means you've got to bring that innovation back into the church walls. So somehow you've got to cast the vision, you have to sell, this is what's happening, these are the great stories, here's the testimonies of these people that have come to Jesus. These are some of the roadblocks they face. Don't do that immediately. Keep it safe, keep it secret for a time, but eventually start telling it to the rest of the church so the early adopters can hear about it and adopt it. Then the early majority. In America, when I first came out with Organic Church book in 2005, I was branded a heretic by several denominations. Publicly. Actually, never privately. They never actually contacted me. They just announced to the world. Including someone in my own denomination. So, you have to have thick skin to be an innovator. You have to be willing to accept that. And sometimes, if you're really apostolic, if you don't get that, you feel like you're doing something wrong. All right? But today, it's not like that. Because of that book and Forgotten Ways and the Shaping of Things to Come and some of my other books and some of Frank Viola's books and some of the church planting movements and the discussion of the missional church and early adopters started buying in and everything. Today, we have passed early adoption and we are into early majority. And because of that, I don't get any public attack anymore. In fact, I'm speaking at some of the larger conferences in America right now on a regular basis. I don't like it, I'm probably stop it, but that's actually happened. Because as a movement, the missional church has passed into the early adoption phase. Now what happens, the laggards are still there. But they can't be vocal now because there's too many people that would be against them. So they only can exercise this passive-aggressive type of response. They're powerless in a sense. So we've passed into, in America, this early majority phase. Perhaps even getting close to late majority, which means we're on the downwards decline pretty soon. Got to innovate something new. So that's just an example. Any questions on this? Thoughts? Experiences?
Just bouncing off what you just said now, I'm curious, where would you picture the church in terms of adopting
Missional church, right.
In terms of AIDS, which books just coming out.
Yeah.
Now, you haven't got criticism over the last couple of years overall being church, but what's going to happen in April when Tom Black comes out? And I know Alan got probably criticism from his
Permanent Revolution.
His patch more than some other books just recently, because it rocks the boat in terms of our approach to the issue.
Yeah.
So where are we on the few Everett Rogers belt in terms of leadership?
I feel like in April, I'm coming out in two ways. All right. First of all, I come from a cessationist denomination. And I'm coming out saying apostles are for today, prophets are today, cessationism is not biblical. Now, I've said that for years, but nobody in the denomination listens to me anyway. It is a scar. Secondly, I'm coming out with a chapter in the book on women in ministry called the Black Swan Effect. That is another thing that probably my denomination and several others might not like. So I feel like I'm innovating again, and I am going to once again receive some of the onslaught. In fact, my book on primal fire will shake a lot of things up, I think. What do you think?
No.
You don't think so?
No. Well, I thought so on organic leadership that didn't happen.
Yeah, that book should be probably my most controversial book organic leadership, and it doesn't get any. People just
stood around and said, "You got to get ready for this. This is going to not be good for you." but it didn't happen.
Didn't really get much.
I think, just my thought on the question, I think because the apostolic gift and the prophetic gift has now become almost mainstream conversation with people in mission agencies, mission movements, and even in churches. The definitions are all different, I get that, but at least the idea that they exist is out there. So I think it's going to be less of an idea. Maybe the next book that we might all write somehow on how that really can live out and how it changes church leadership or regional leadership, or I don't know what happens, I think, in the future. That's going to really affect a lot of pastors. This is kind of sets the framework. This is my perspective only. It sets the framework where we start dealing with how does it look in local churches and maybe how they've been misled by single leadership. There's a lot of that here in this room. I think that's going to really set people on edge.
I do talk about, I redefine what a deacon is. I talk about women serving in all these roles. I talk about what is the evidence of baptism of the Holy Spirit. That could get in trouble. I talk about a lot of things but maybe it's framed in a way that won't receive that. We'll see.
How do you grow thick skin?
How do you what?
How do you grow thick skin?
How do you grow a thick skin? The only way to get calluses is through a lot of conflict and friction.
Blood.
Yeah. The question isn't how to grow a thick skin, it's how to have compassion and love in spite of the thick skin. That's the tougher question. Yeah.
I think part of the reason why we don't necessarily see the positive gifting so much in the church is because it's crushed out of people.
Yeah.
I have my theory on that, especially in the Baptist denomination. We look at the fivefold apostle gifts and say, which one would we like to be the leader of our church? Let's pick the one who's less likely to hurt us. Let's pick the pastor. And the trouble is, we bring a pastor in, and he holds everybody's hands, and he doesn't do anything innovative or whatever else like that, and it keeps us where we are. I have another question back here, and this is...
He's a Queenslander, okay?
I know.
I thought there's a reason I like Queensland. Go ahead.
You're obviously the litigation capital. You're leaving us behind, although I think we're catching up. How do you actually, does this whole organic thing stay under that whole legal litigation radar, as in take anyone leadership taking responsibility, getting sued for making a decision about whatever else like that, or public meetings, or what do you do with that?
Because that's a real barrier, I think, very quickly. But for you guys, you guys, that's your culture, so.
That's fine. I think I'm going to sue you for that.
Oh no, he said it in love.
Doesn't matter. He's got deep pockets. No.
I think culturally we're probably, a number of things have been said. Culturally, you guys are equipped for this. Our culture can move on this sort of thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, things are changing, and that is, responsible leadership and risk management. All the risk stuff, death stuff. It's nice to sit around, but then you sit in a board meeting and it's just not responsible leadership. The boxes are getting.
During the break, somebody asked a question about all this litigation, and you have to make sure every Sunday school teacher is vetted before, but if you really, if you know the people in your church and you've been with them for some time, I'm not going to take a new believer and say, hey, babysit my grandkids. It just doesn't make any sense, does it? Or if you do church with kids involved, that kind of takes away those problems, doesn't it? But if you know people in the conventional churches like this, if you know the people, I don't understand where this threat comes from. Will it happen at some point? Well, of course, at some point there's a rogue everywhere. But that's really, you can't protect against that. So I think a lot of these questions, the way they were posed to me, comes from an assumption that I don't know these people, and they have backgrounds, criminal backgrounds, pedophilia backgrounds that I'm unaware of. I just don't, from my context, that doesn't make sense. Maybe I'm not answering the question.
I think it comes from the reality that most abuse happens within the family. So just saying I know them that isn't the same.
But we have a government standard anyway. We have to have working with children checks. Anyone that works with children has to have them. Yeah. So.
I think we're back to the advantages and disadvantages part of it. So the more decentralized you are, this is not an issue. There's no pockets to go after. There's no hierarchy to punish. The more centralized you become, the more you have to think about this. You might have to get insurance for your board members. You might have to get insurance for when you have your meetings and those kind of things. So it's adding to the expense on the centralized part of things.
The other thing I think that is possibly, I'm not sure where the Americans stand on this issue, but we've just started the Royal Commission into child abuse in the church and within the care system, you know. And I think people are very conscious of it, and I think as a church we have to acknowledge our history and say, you're right, we stuffed up big time and we tried to hide it and it's wrong and it will never happen again. And I guess that's about rebuilding relationships to me. That's
Reconciliation.
You know, it's we have to show ourselves to be trustworthy because we're not seen that way. Regardless of whether that's legitimate or not. There are a big percentage of people in our society who do not trust the church because of what happened in the past.
Part of our story is that when we started to introduce the idea, we had...
What idea? To who?
Of transfusion or of
Yep.
growing at Central. We had a buy-in, but then all of a sudden there was 20 people said, we're out of here. You know, and that was a bit of a shock.
Yep.
Because at first they said, yeah, let's give it a test, let's run with it. Retrospect, well, I wish we'd have heard this stuff before, but hey, the Lord lets us, you know, stumble forward, and that's been exciting. But losing 20 people of old persuasion, most of them, who had a bit of hardening of the arteries. Yeah, that was good.
Let me just say the Skunk Works idea, the Water the Green Spotted idea, it's a good one. It's not the only way.
Yeah.
Some of the stories we tell in our church, in Church Transfusion book, didn't do it that way. Like the megachurch I talked about. It just was a top-down change. You can do it other ways. And sometimes you can minimize the bleeding. Sometimes you can't. So we're not saying this is the only way to do it. I am saying that if you don't get the DNA in the disciples, you're not changing anything that's of significance. That part I'm saying is absolute. Whether you use the Skunk Works or not, that's up to you and your environment, listening to the Lord. It's a way to bring about a more gradual change to an existing organization. I suggest it, or at least to be considered, but I don't think it's the only way to do it. And sometimes a quicker change, even though you may bleed more right at first, may be a better way to go. And you got to listen to the Lord and do what He says.
Yeah, just on that score, it's that quicker bleed or minimize the bleeding, but you're suggesting that inevitably there's likely to be some bleeding. And I'm thinking about transfusion churches who, many of whom recognize that they're bleeding on that downward slope and bleed to death if nothing changes. But they're at the stage where they are so vulnerable that too much change will cause them to die anyway.
Yeah.
And that's the risk factor. You know, can I afford that now? Because I've already gone from 5 days to 4 days to 3 days. I've gone from 80 to 60 to 40 people. What do I do? How do I minimize the bleeding and create the upward swing?
Sometimes the pulling of the plug when you're on life support systems is really the only option you have. And then you just wait, hold your breath, and see if God rebirths something or if He just lets it die. And so if you've been on the downward slope long enough, there's nothing more to do than say, we're pulling the plug, we're putting for sale on the property, find some place to go, and we'll see what happens. And God might then, I've heard stories where suddenly someone sweeps in, buys the property, births something new with some of the other people, they get all excited and it's transfused and you didn't do anything except put for sale sign on the property. So, I mentioned in one of my books, all across the U.S., in every single city, there's $1 million piece of property that stays closed 6 days. And at 10 o'clock on Sunday, an older gentleman comes with some keys, unlocks the door, 7 people come in and sit down in among all the pews. You've got no hair, you've got gray hair, you've got blue hair. They'll sing a song, someone will talk about something, and then they'll disperse and go home. Lock the building, and it will sit for 6 days. You're probably not going to transfuse that church. And it's $1 million property in an ideal location that's being used by 7 people. And their idea is, we have to keep this going for God. For the people who went before us. We're doing this because we don't want God to fail. And they don't understand what it means to die to Christ and all this. God bless them. Eventually that property is going to be freed up because those 7 people don't have that much longer to go. But that's just a reality, and I don't know, I think pull the plug on that is my suggestion, but a lot of people would say I'm heartless. I don't want to be heartless. And I also am sure, because I've seen it a dozen times, where they do sell that property and the money gets distributed to things that will never make a difference.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a resistance to that. Like, if we sell this off, it's just going to go back to the union and they're going to do this and that. Well, there's a centralising dynamic that's real in the denominations, too. And so, part of there's this resistance to, hang on, this is local money, local people. There's some...
we've got that story. I mean, we've had that very story where, and this is being videotaped, so I hope it's okay. But in my own region, there was a church that had died, and they just said we got to call it quits, and they deeded their property over to this brand new skunk works thing called the Church Planting Board that we were starting. And that was $1 million property, and 50 churches were born because of it. 50. During that 10 years where those 50 churches were started, 5 other properties went up for sale. All that money, or almost most all that money, all went to the denomination's church planting agency that within 5 more years ceased to exist. So just think of how many, if we started 50 with one of those properties, what could we have done with all 5? It's just this, you can't measure this economy by those standards. It's just, you're not going to get that kind of, you have to just trust God to provide and move forward. And sometimes pulling the plug's the right thing to do. Sometimes letting the 7 people have their church building for another 15 years is the right thing to do. I can't answer that. I can't answer it. The right answer is what? Listen to Jesus and do what he says. It's lunchtime.